Okay.
Just gonna talk about.
Meeting is being recorded. All right, I think I can. Photo one, people are starting to trickle in. Okay, everyone, let's get started. Welcome all to our biomes this week. So I'm Ken Gillingham, professor of environmental and energy economics. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. Our very own Professor Yuan Yao is an associate professor of industrial ecology and sustainable systems. Her research is on sustainable solutions that can support industrial development with a focus on emerging technologies. She uses interdisciplinary approaches in industrial ecology, sustainable engineering, and machine learning to develop systems analysis tools to support engineering and policy decisions towards sustainability. A major area of her research is on the bioeconomy and sustainable production, as well as wood production, biomass. So I'm sure we're going to learn quite a bit about that. And you can see the title is a multi-scale life cycle systems modeling for a carbon negative bioeconomy. It's an exciting title. She has an NSF Career Award. It's a prestigious award. She's received the Landis Medal from the International Society of Industrial Ecology. She was named the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, one of the 35 under 35. And she's also an editor of the Journal of Resources, associate editor of the Journal of Resources Conservation and Recycling. She received her PhD in chemical engineering from Northwestern and her bachelor's in metallurgical engineering from Northeastern University in China. And I think she's going to be giving a fascinating talk about the bioeconomy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Yao.
Thank you, Ken, for a very nice introduction. So hello, everyone. Very nice to see you all here. And today I'll talk about a multi-scale life cycle system modeling for a carbon negative bioeconomy. I'm sure many of you have heard about the concept of bioeconomy, which really encourages the use of biomass to replace fossil fuels for producing chemicals, energy, and all kinds of products used in our society. And we have very diverse biomass resources available on the Earth. I put some example here, like biomass coming from forest, from agricultural sectors, the waste generated by us human beings, or from animals, or from different industrial sectors. Among all those diverse biomass resources, forest is one of the most abundant biomass resource that's already widely be used by the industry. I put some photo here to show you some example wood product, such as pulp and paper product, those flooring, furnitures. Some forestry residues already be turned into bioenergy, and this photo is for textile for our clothes made from wood pulp. All those products have very different functionalities, but they actually have very similar life cycles. They all start from biomass cultivation, like forest plantation. We go through those harvesting activities. We convert them into different kind of a product. We use those products in our society. And once those products reach the end of their lifetime, they may get recycled, burned, or landfilled, depending on how people treat them at their end of life. So biomass is a renewable natural resource. It does not mean that utilizing biomass is environmentally burden-free. For example, during tree growth, they take up CO2 from the atmosphere. But all those life cycle activities I show you here, they emit greenhouse gas emissions back to the atmosphere. So if we want to know whether a biomass utilization pathway contributes to a carbon negative bioeconomy or not, we need to understand this net GHG balances across this entire life cycle. Greenhouse gases are associated with climate change, but there are also many other environmental concerns different stakeholders may have. So if we want to develop a sustainable carbon negative bioeconomy, we have to answer some really important questions, such as what are the potential environmental impact if we use different biomass in different ways? Are they economically viable? What are their impact on the entire economy? What are the potential societal benefits or potential risks? Are there any trade-offs among different aspects of sustainability? So to answer those questions, industry ecologists like myself, we already have some tools available in our field. I put some example here. Like first one, life cycle assessment. which is a standardized tool to evaluate the environmental impact across the product life cycle. We also have a material flow analysis that can really understand and quantify the energy and the material flows within the industry, and more importantly, between the industry and the environment. We also have an economic input-output analysis that has an environmentally extended application to understand the environmental footprint for one product across economy-wide supply chains. Those tools are all very powerful, but they still have a very limited capability to understand our very complicated biomass systems because of this multi-scale impact. So when I say scale, it can mean different things. It can mean spatial scale at different locations across different regions. It can also mean temporal scale across different time. So when we collect those biomass from different locations with different rotation lengths, we could get biomass with very large variations in their quantity and also quality. Many biomass are supplied by different ecosystems. That's by nature, they are highly dynamic. Not just the ecosystem, looking at the industrial system, we also have this multi-scale impact. If we look at one single biorefinery versus we're looking at the impact across supply chains or across regional-wide adoption of a biomass utilization pathway, those impacts would be very different. And all those system analysis tools I showed you in the previous slide, they are static method. So they have a very limited capability in understanding those dynamics related to biomass systems. So my research focused on addressing these fundamental challenges by developing new innovative modeling framework. So in the rest of my presentation, I will show you some new method and new framework developed by my research group and demonstrated by several interesting case studies. So the first one is our biochar project. So biochar is a carbon-rich material that can be made from different kinds of biomass. I put a photo here to show you what biochar look like. So carbon in biochar is very stable. So that's why people often call biochar as a carbon storage or negative emission technology. It's a very popular subject currently in the carbon market. So biochar has very wide applications. You can apply biochar to agricultural land as a soil amendment. You can burn it as an energy source. You can even use it for water treatment. Current challenge is biochar, this material, they can be made from so many different biomass species. I put some example here, like pine, maple, willow, so many others. When we use different biomass, they have a different compositions, like carbon content, ash content, moisture content. Different composition would give you different mass and energy balances and also environmental emissions during biochar production. So if say we want to do LCA or even just a carbon footprint accounting for this material made from different biomass, we have to do this analysis for each of them, which is extremely challenging because currently there's no database and no tool can just tell you how those mass and energy balances and environmental emissions would be different if we use different biomass. So to address this challenge, a few years ago, my group published the first integrated modeling framework that's really couple machine learning approaches with traditional chemistry kinetic model and also chemical engineering simulations. So the input of this framework are those experimental data people can measure in their lab, such as the composition of their biomass, the condition of pyrolysis, like temperature, residence time, and output are the data people can use in their life cycle assessment, like carbon emissions, the energy consumption, or composition of gas and solid product, because some gas products may become environmental emissions. So in the recent years, we have been using this as a foundation to really develop a machine learning assisted life cycle assessment framework that can capture all the activities involved in biochar life cycles. We include all the upstream activities like resource extraction, the production of biochar. We also include the downstream activities, like when we apply biochar to agricultural land, what are those emissions coming from the land and also coming from biochar decay? So our framework can evaluate not just the carbon footprint, but also many other environmental concerns, such as toxicity, acidification, eutrophication, many others. We also gathered a global data set of crop yield responses when we apply biochar to 4 types of major cropland with different duration time. So let me show you some of our exciting major findings. So those figures I tell you what are the life cycle environmental impact if we want to produce 1 metric ton of biochar derived from different type of biomass species. The one in the middle is carbon footprint, quantified by global warming potential. The first one here is for acidification. The third one is for eutrophication, because we considered uncertainty. So that's why each of our results are shown as the box plot rather than the single value. And the x-axis here for each figure is for different type of biomass residues. So if you look at the first one, acidification and carbon footprint, global warming potential, you can see that if we use fiber residues or stimulated residues to produce biochar, they generally lead to higher environmental burdens compared to other biomass residues. However, if you look at eutrophication, you can see that the trend across different type of biomass residues are slightly different if we look at it compared to the first two. So the major takeaway message here is biomass species really matter from a life cycle perspective, although this trend across different biomass species may be different depending on what specific environmental impact you care most about. So this is for environmental burdens. We're also looking at the global data set of those crop yield responses, which are shown in this red box. So we find that if we use some biomass like stimulated residues produce biochar, they have high environmental burdens, but they actually do a very good job to increase the crop yield. So this reviewer of potential trade-offs between the environmental impact and the crop yield responses. So those are the process level understandings. So we leverage this understanding to further did a global level analysis. I know this is a little bit busy, so let me walk you through. So first, the two map on the top here. This figure, colorful map, is to show you what are those agricultural residues available at different locations globally. The second map, most blue color here, is to tell you what are the major type of forestry residues available globally at different locations. And the second row, this two map, most in green color, is to tell you if we use the best available biomass residues at each location to produce biochar and apply biochar to local farm, what is the net carbon footprint would be? So you can see most regions are covered by green color, right? So that means this practice would lead to a net carbon negative system. So we have net carbon removal from the atmosphere, which is great. However, if you look at this one, there are some regions covered by red color. So that means if we use the best available agricultural residue in those locations to produce biochar and apply biochar to local farm, they actually contribute to more GHG emissions. They are not contribute a carbon negative systems. We also have a two map on the bottom, which is to show you what are the crop yield responses when we apply biochar, and this is to different locations. This is for using biochar made from agricultural residue. This is from forestry residue. And we do find that there are some regions that biochar can do a very good job to increase crop yield, but it's not necessarily contribute to a net carbon negative systems. Again, this reviewer potential trade-off between the environmental burdens and crop yield responses, and our analysis can identify the location where this trade-off is most likely to occur. So I want to this project just to show you how we can use a framework that's really combine mechanistic engineering simulations and data-driven approaches to better understand the environmental burden of a biomass-based material made from different biomass species. And if we want to develop a sustainable bioeconomy, the takeaway message is we have to carefully consider and select the biomass species we use for utilization. And our modeling framework really provided decision support tool and advanced knowledge to support such a selection. So many biomass are supplied by different ecosystems, as I mentioned before. So another direction we have been working on is really figure out a way that we can couple ecosystem modeling with LCA and also leverage those process knowledge obtained from simulations and data-driven approaches. So now I want to switch gear to show you another project to demonstrate this framework to help you understand how we can use this framework to better understand the role of ecosystem when we try to understand the environmental impact of biomass. So in this one, we are working on my favorite type of biomass, which are forest residues. I put a photo here to show you what they look like. So they are limbs, branches, small diameter trees people cut down during thinning, harvesting activities, and people do not want them. And overstocked forest residue causes a lot of problems like wildfire. And according to the US Department of Energy, we really have a lot of forest residue available in the nation. So currently in the industry, there are a lot of efforts in trying to figure out what are the possible ways we can utilize those underutilized resources? One strategy is we collect some of them, convert them into bioenergy, and capture those CO2 to store them underground. We call them BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Another one is we collect some of them, do pyrolysis to produce biochar, and apply biochar to agricultural land, as I just showed in the previous project. Both of them are very popular concepts currently in the carbon market. So a lot of life cycle assessment study already published for those two pathways. They consider the forest management activities, which is great. And a more recent study start to consider counterfactual scenarios, which means if we do not utilize those forest residue, what would happen? The gap is none of the previous literature have considered the impact of removing forest residues on soil carbon. For example, Renewable Fuel Standard is a federal government program managed under US EPA. They assume forest residue is a carbon neutral feedstock. So if there are any producers, they collect those forest residue, convert them into biochar, apply to this federal government program, and when they do LCA, they can just assign a zero value on soil carbon. Because people assume this impact on soil carbon must be negligible if we compare them to the entire life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of biofuel. So in this project, we really wanted to understand whether this long-standing assumption used in public policy and also literature was true or not. So we developed a framework that's really integrated soil carbon modeling into LCA of biofuel. We simulate different growth cases, climate conditions for forest systems, and we're looking at 3 cases. The first one is all decay case, which means we don't utilize those forest residue, just leave them on ground, then they will go through natural decomposition, which is a very common practice in the field. The second one is we do pile burning. So we pile some of them, burn them to mitigate the wildfire risk, which is also another very common practice. The third one is the industry is very interested. They collect some of them, we convert them into biofuel and use those biofuel in vehicles. Now let me show you some of our major findings. So this bar chart is to tell you how much are the life cycle GHG emissions associated with 1 megajoule of biofuel made from forest residues. The red color here is for emissions from soil organic carbon changes. The blue color is for life cycle GHG emission that the previous LCA study would accounted for. We did a Monte Carlo simulation to consider all the uncertainty, so that's why the total value will have an arrow bar rather than single value. So just from this result, you can see that this red bar, which are soil carbon emissions, definitely add additional significant GHG emissions to the LCA result. They are not negligible as the previous literature assumed. We also did analysis looking at a biorefinery that implemented carbon capture and storage, which would make your biorefinery become carbon negative. So in that case, emissions from soil become one of the major emission sources. We're also looking at a case where biorefinery co-producing biochar and biofuel, which is a very popular process design. We get very similar conclusions, and actually the contribution percentage from the red bar here is even larger. We all know soil carbon is highly dynamic. They may change with the time, right? So we look at different time frame. All the way from 25 years to the 100 years, we do find this red bar gets smaller and smaller when we look at the longer time horizon, but this does not change our conclusion that the soil carbon really matter. So one of the major recommendations we give in this study is that we need to include soil carbon assessment in life cycle assessment for biofuels or any other kind of bio-based product that's using forest residues. It is not always a good assumption that forest residue would always be a carbon neutral feedstock. So I use this project to show you how we can use this powerful framework to really understand the role of ecosystems. And if we want to develop a sustainable bioeconomy using any kind of biomass, we need to carefully consider how ecosystem may respond when we harvest those biomass from them for further industry used purpose. So the 2 projects I showed you so far are looking at the impact all associated with a specific product, like 1 megajoule of biofuel, 1 metric ton of biochar. Sometimes decision makers, especially those policymakers, they are very interested in understanding large scale impact. Like if we implement those technology pathway in the entire region or nation, what are the environmental implications? So that's why in the recent year, we have been more focused on developing those multi-scale life cycle modeling framework, which is a bottom-up approach where we scale up those process-based level understandings, and also couple geospatial analysis and dynamic modeling with LCA. We try to use those frameworks to better understand if we implement those scalable nature-based solutions at different regional and temporal scales, how their environmental implication would differ. So to demonstrate this framework, I want to show you the project we just published early this year, where we're looking at the carbon removal opportunity in Brazil. We are very interested in Brazil because it is the world's largest eucalyptus producers. In Brazil, you would see 3 types of forest majorly associated with eucalyptus. The first one is this monoculture plantation. You see those trees, they are really uniformly grown, right? So they're mostly because they are majorly for industry purpose, like for pulp and paper production. The second one, you see this is secondary natural regrowth of forest, which have much diversity. The third one is this very interesting landscape called a forest mosaic. So at one side, you see those trees really uniformly grow, but at the other side, you see this very diverse forest. This is because local government policy, they require the industry to preserve some forest land adjacent to the forest land area used for industrial purpose. So this is why you see this very interesting landscape. And along the coastal area of Brazil, we call them Mata Atlantica region, they also have a lot of marginal land available, like agricultural land, pasture land, farmland that do not have very high carbon stock. So currently in the carbon market, there's a lot of interest to restore forest cover on those marginal land to remove carbon from CO2, from atmosphere. So if we want to do that, there are several ways to do it. The first one is we just do it for protection purpose. And we expected to see this secondary regrowth of forest, very diverse forest, to come back and take CO2 from atmosphere. This is a very common practice. You can see if you go look at those forest-based projects in carbon market. Another one is we do production forest, which means we plant those trees, but we also harvest them to produce pulp and paper. And after harvesting, we replant trees. We chose pulp and paper because Brazil is one of the largest pulp producers in the world. So they already have a very mature industrial infrastructure. Of course, to comply with local government policy, we need to do them in this forest mosaic way. The third one is another direction industry is very interested. They want to use those wood coming from production forest to produce a high value added product, such as cross-laminated timber, which is a new engineered wood product that is very strong. They can replace carbon intensive concrete and steel in buildings, and they are already commercialized. So if we produce this, we can also have some money to collect those forest residues, convert them to biochar, again, apply biochar to the land for soil amendment. So for all those strategies that combine different solutions, which are the best in terms of GHG mitigation and also cost in the local context? No literature has ever answered that question. So we applied our multi-scale modeling framework, which really combined the forest growth model with the soil carbon model with LCA model, and we regionalized them to different locations, considering different time frame. And in this project, we definitely collaborate with forestry faculty like Professor Mark Ashton in YSE and also Professor Daniel Piatto from Brazil. So our model can track how different parts of trees are turned into different wood products, and how those wood products are used in our society and how they are treated at their end of life. And we majorly looking at the 3 scenarios I mentioned before. Like the first one is for secondary regrowth for the baseline. The second one is for pulp and paper production. The third one is a very interesting emerging scenario. We produce a COT, cross-laminated timber, and also biochar. So let me show you some of our major findings. So this is a figure to show you what are the net GHG balances for the entire study region. And the numbers on the top is for a different timeline. So if we look at the baseline here for secondary regrowth, we see that all those green bars, they are negative, right? So that means we have net carbon removed from atmosphere, which is great. Then we look at scenario 1. That is the case, we produce pulp and paper. In the early years, their value are negative, but in the long term, like 72 or 100 years, all their value turned positive. So that means we actually have more GHG emissions emitted back to the atmosphere. So this is because pulp and paper production are highly energy intensive. And the scenario 2 and 3 are for cross-laminated timber combined with biochar, but they differ in the rotation lengths. So we do find that the rotation lengths do not change our result much, but compared to the baseline case, we do find that COT plus biochar can mitigate slightly more greenhouse gas emissions. Part of that are attributed by this gray color box with slanted lines. This represents the substitution credit. So that means we use COT to replace carbon-intensive concrete and steel material. Some people may argue in the future, those highly carbon-intensive material industry may be decarbonized. Well, that's maybe true. So we simulate different scenarios, shared social economic pathway scenario to reflect different levels of decarbonization in the future. Their results are shown as those yellow and red color dots. We do find that if we can enter into a highly decarbonized future, those material substitution credit will be reduced. So those are the results for the entire study region. We're also looking at what are those land use decisions considering GHG mitigation only. So that means we try to figure out what is the best solution at different locations if we want to maximize the GHG mitigation. In the early year, like year 24 and year 48, you see most of the region are covered by green color, right? So that means those regions, they would choose secondary regrowth if they want to maximize the GHG mitigation. For the long term, like year 72 or year 100, you see a lot of regions turn their color to this blue and more orange color. So that means those locations, they would choose those wood product COT and biochar to maximize their GHG mitigation. However, you can see there are many regions that have mixed color, mixed together, right? So that means the best solution is different at different locations, and this differences is also changing when you look at a different time scale. So the takeaway message here I want to say is we really need to have region-specific strategies. We also need to consider how this strategy may be changing when we're looking at a decision within different time frame. Those are the results mostly for GHG mitigation. In reality, rarely landowner will just make a decision based on carbon. Many times they also consider cost. So we also did a cost analysis to really understand what are the potential net present values for different scenarios. And we do find that for those wood products like COT and biochar, they could provide the highest economic return. So we later run those spatial analysis looking at different land use decisions, but consider more social economic factors. Then we do find that for the most of a region, regardless early or later years, most of them would choose those wood product, COT plus biochar, using the shorter rotation. But again, there are still some regions where you can see those mixed color that highlights the need for region-specific strategies. So I use this study to really show you how we can use this multi-scale life cycle modeling framework to really understand the environmental implications of those temporal and spatial dynamics. If we want to develop a sustainable bioeconomy, we have to consider when we implement even the same solution at different location and different time, how its performance may be different. And our modeling framework really advanced our fundamental knowledge and also provide a decision-making support tool for such decisions. So all the three case studies I show you so far range from the process scale to the regional level, very large scale adoption. Sometimes when I present those results, people actually ask me questions that focus on very, very tiny scale. So totally opposite side of what I present. For example, there are so many biomass that can be used to produce plastics that are biodegradable. And many times they generate microplastics. So people asked me, what are those environmental impact of microplastics generated from biomass that can also biodegradable in the environment? Are they all good? And also, can life cycle assessment really account for those potential impact, potential risks? So the answer to those questions is actually, it is very challenging currently to evaluate the environmental impact of those biodegradable microplastic, especially for those generated from biomass. Because all the previous LCA study, most of the time, they consider the plastic production and use phases. And when the plastic becomes waste, they assume they would be sent to engineered facility like industry composting or anaerobic digestion for treatment. But in reality, a lot of plastic products, they actually littered into the natural environment. They broke down into microplastics, and those microplastics go to soil, freshwater, seawater. They contribute to global warming potential because during biodegradation, they generate greenhouse gases. They also pose ecotoxicity to those species living in ecosystems. And currently, there's no method that can really evaluate those environmental impact in LCA when those microplastics go to the environment. Well, at least no method before our paper was published last year, because we developed the first environmental impact method that can be used in LCA to really quantify this impact for biodegradable microplastic. And because we focused on such a tiny particle, so I like to call it as a really micro level expansion of our multi-scale life cycle modeling framework. So I applied our method to 5 major plastics for demonstration. So 3 of them are made from bio-based, 2 of them are made from fossil fuel, and they are all biodegradable plastics. I want to make a clarification here because many times I find that people get confused about the biodegradable and bio-based plastic and think they are the same thing, right? They are not the same thing. So biodegradable plastics can be made from biomass or fossil fuels because their biodegradability is determined by their chemical structure. They are not determined by where they come from. So we chose these 5 types of plastics for demonstration because 1, they are all commercially available. 2, they are actually representative type of biodegradable plastics in the market. So let me show you some of our results. So these 3 figures on the top is to show you aquatic ecotoxicity. So that means the ecotoxicity posed by those microplastics when they go to the freshwater systems and to those species living there. We look at different particle size, like first one for 1,000 micron, this for 10 micron, this for 0.1 micron. We also have another 3 figure for the climate change impact quantified by global warming potential in CO2 equivalent. So because we did a Monte Carlo simulation to consider all uncertainty, so that's why all of our results are shown as a curve rather than single deterministic value. So let's first looking at those particles are relatively larger, like 1,000 micron and 10 micron. If we look at those plastic that have low biodegradability, like this purple color, which is a PLA here, they have a higher ecotoxicity, but they have the lowest climate change impact. So this is a potential trade-off between these 2 environmental impacts. However, interestingly, we find that this environmental trade-off disappear when we look at a very tiny particle like 0.1 micron. Like PLA here, it has the highest ecotoxicity and also highest climate change impact. So one of the major conclusions is we identify this environmental trade-off, but it actually depends on microplastic sizes. So this is the first one major finding. Another one is we try to examine those conclusions widely made by previous literature. So previous LCA study for those bio-based and biodegradable plastics, which means they are biodegradable plastics made from biomass, usually they make 2 conclusions. The first one is those greenhouse gas emissions generated at the end of life of those plastics do not matter at all because they can be fully offset by biogenic carbon uptake during biomass growth. The second one is people find upstream production, which means manufacturing activities, resource extraction activities, they dominate life cycle GHG emissions. But our study, which are able to account for the impact of microplastic, find that these 2 conclusions may not always be true. So let's look at the first one. So if you look at the PHB at a very large particle size here, the yellow bar here is for greenhouse gas emission released at the end of life of those microplastics when they go to the fresh water. And the green bar here is for the biogenic carbon uptake. So you can see this yellow bar here is much larger than this biogenic green bar here. They cannot be fully offset by this. So this first conclusion is not always true, at least if we're looking at the PHB at a larger particle size here. If we look at the second one, the upstream production, they are represented by those gray colors shown as the slanted line here. If we look at the PHB at a smaller particle size, well, this conclusion is true. This gray box dominates life cycle result, right? But if you look at the PHB at larger particle sizes, or same TPS at larger particle sizes, or even PLA at smaller particle sizes, this gray box, it is not the dominant factor. So this second conclusion is not true either, at least in those cases. So basically, our result really challenging these 2 long-standing conclusions reported by previous literature that were not able to consider the impact of microplastics. Another myth in the field is that people all know biodegradation generates greenhouse gas emissions. So does that mean higher biodegradation, we will have higher greenhouse gas emissions, therefore higher climate change impact? Well, our results find that it's not a simple linear relationship. So in this figure, y-axis is to show you the global warming potential for climate change impact. The x-axis here is for the biodegradation rate. So when we increasing those biodegradation from low to high, you can see that this curve first increasing, and depending on which carbon accounting method, you may reach a peak or directly reach a plateau and then decreasing. So it's not a simple linear increasing relationship. So for those researchers like engineers who are developing those new type of biodegradable plastics, they should try to avoid the biodegradation rate around this area in order to avoid a very high climate change impact. So those are the three major conclusions from our case study. The original motivation for us really to do this work at the first place was really to develop those ready-to-use categorization factors that LCA practitioners can use, or those broader research community who study microplastic. So I have presented this barcode to so many different conferences and workshops, but basically it will take people to our lab website that can download Excel, that we put all the factors we generate there. And for those LCA practitioners or for researchers, they just need to know the type of microplastics and the sizes. Then they can find those factors with uncertainty ranges that they can directly use in their LCA calculation or impact assessment calculation. So this is a work I'm really excited about in the recent year. We look at these very tiny particles at the micro level. Another direction that's also getting me very excited in the latest year is to go to the opposite direction, to have very macro level, global level expansion of our multi-scale life cycle modeling framework. So this cross-laminated timber is the product I mentioned before. They are really popular. People are so interested because they can replace those carbon resource-intensive material used in buildings. But whenever I talk about this product, especially when I talk about it to the general public, people ask me some very interesting questions, such as, when we use more wood, does that mean we will have a decreased forest, therefore we have a decreased carbon stored in forest? That is a very intuitive idea, at least to many general public. They are thinking of those new wood product. Another one is, if we have this new wood product, how will it affect the traditional wood product like pulp and paper industry and their associated carbon pool? And if we all consider those potential market responses, what are the net carbon consequences across the life cycle of the forest and all kinds of products in different regions in the world? None of those questions can be answered by traditional life cycle assessment. So that's why in the recent year, we have been working with economists like Professor Robert Mendelsohn here in YSE that try to couple our LCA model with the economic model. So we first did those regionalized LCA for cross-laminated timber. We include all the activities involved in the supply chain, like plantation, lumber production, manufacturing. You use the COT in buildings, and once buildings get demolished, they may recycled, burn, or landfill. We also simulate the new wood demand based on future building projection. Then we feed this new wood demand to global timber model, which is an ecological economic model that can really simulate how timber price and the timber market may respond when we have a new wood demand. They would also simulate how landowners at different regions may respond to those market changes. Then we use this responsive feedback into our LCA model so we can estimate, what are the global level GHG emissions compared to the business as usual baseline where we do not adopt this new technology. So this is one of our results show you the global level GHG emissions, and for the scenario 3, the most optimistic scenario, that we assume very high wood demand and very fast adoption of COT technology. And we find that toward 2100, they may help us to mitigate about 40 gigaton of CO2 equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions, which is a very big number. And a part of that attributed by this green bar, which are increased biogenic carbon uptake. So that is because a new wood demand come into the market, they will raise the timber price. And that would incentivize the industry to investment more in the plantation forest. So we end up having more forest area, so we have more carbon stored in forest. Another part is this new wood product really affects the traditional pulp and paper production. As I mentioned in the previous case study, pulp and paper production are highly energy intensive. So the decreased pulp and paper production also reduced the GHG emission from that industry, so we accounted for them here. So basically, at the global level, our result shows that this COT mass timber product can be really good to help us to mitigate GHG emissions, to combat the climate change. However, when we look at its impact on regional forest areas, we show this impact varies substantially. So this is the result again for the same highly optimistic scenario 3, and we'll look at different regions and the regional forest area in 2050. So on the top, we see a lot of regions like Western Europe, United States, China, Canada, South Asia. They all have a very high forest area increase if you look at this little triangle. Part of that attribute to this green bar, which are increased managed forest. Another part are blue bar, which are increased plantation forest. But if you look at some region, for example, Brazil here, they have a net increasing of forest area, look at the triangle, but they also have a decrease of the yellow bar, which are natural forest. We all know Brazil is a biodiversity hotspot. So those losses of natural forest would cause biodiversity concern. So this indicates a potential regional trade-off between the carbon mitigation and also the conservation. We also further look into the future, like 2100, we find those countries on the top keep increasing, but those countries in the middle, they have losses for natural forest. They also have increases mostly for managed forest or plantation. So the total forest area balance out. The only exception is for Southeast Asia, where our model predict there will be losses of the regional forest area. So for this project, the major takeaway message is these new wood products are really good. If you look at the global level, carbon mitigation, but its impact on the region are really very substantially. So again, we need to have region-specific strategies even when we try to implement the same nature-based solutions. So far, I showed you different projects that cover different topics, all related to nature-based or engineering solutions to climate change, and they are all related to bioeconomy. Limited by time, I couldn't cover some other exciting projects related to advanced biomass materials, engineering-based carbon capture and storage. We also have several ongoing, very exciting enhanced rock weathering projects I don't have time to cover, but if you're interested, I'm really happy to tell you more after the seminar. So if we want to implement all those different bioeconomy pathways at different locations, at a different scale, in a sustainable way, many times we need to make so many different decisions at different level. For example, at the lab scale, those researchers, scientists, engineers, they need to make a decision on which specific pathway they want to pursue. If we want to scale up any of those solutions, we need to figure out how to design those processes at the plant scale, how to design those supply chain at different regions, and even at the global level, how to promote those adoptions. So this is the figure from a paper we published last year with my colleague, Professor Tom Grado, and also Professor Narasma Rao here, where we try to map out how different system analysis tools have been used to support those decisions at different levels. And actually, my research group used most of them, and we couple many of them. And whenever I show those multi-scale modeling approaches, people always ask me, one, how to select the best model at different level, and two, when we use those models across different levels and even couple some of them, how can we make sure they really deliver consistent decision making? So my answer is, I think we really need to develop very close collaborations among different experts and researchers, like from engineering, from ecology, from economics, from social and policy sciences, and it depends on what specific decision making we want to inform. We may really need to develop a tailored modeling strategy to make sure our results are useful for decision makers with reasonable levels of technical details and data. So that's pretty much the end. I just want to highlight several major conclusions. I showed you some life cycle system modeling frameworks we developed that can really help us to understand the sustainability implications of different scalable bioeconomy pathways and also related to carbon removal. Scale matters. We really need to have a holistic understanding of ecosystem and industrial system across different space and time, and we need to have a tailored modeling strategy to support decision making at different level. The last one, I think, is the most important. That is, whenever we develop any solutions using biomass, we really need to develop them hand in hand together with the proper consideration and management for those ecosystems. So at the end, I think this is probably the busiest slide of this talk, since I have many people to thank. So I want to thank all of the speakers and also big thank to all of the collaborators. Many of them are here today. I really appreciate all of your support and enjoyed working with you. And then we also have a collaborator across Yale campus. We have many external collaborators, like from Harvard, Princeton, many US universities. We also work with researchers from Brazil, Europe, Canada. And at the end, I want to give one big thanks to all of my postdocs and students. Without them, none of the work I have shown you today would have ever happened. At the end, I want to thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, I think we have some time for questions. Please, Eli.
Thanks, Yuan. I love hearing you speak because I love hearing you speak because I always find you so innovative. So what I want to know though is how does innovation actually fit into these multi-scale models when you're showing me projections out to 2050, 2100
There are a lot of
on like
uncertainty.
cross-laminated timber? Like, wow, like how do you deal with that in this?
Yes. So when we talk about those innovative technology, we also mention a concept called TRL, technology readiness level. So crossland timber is a technology that have a very high TRL level because it's already been commercialized. So when we project the future, we're only looking at the potential improvement, like further improve your energy efficiency, further improve your manufacturing and material efficiency, those parameters, and we run different scenarios. But when we're looking at some technology that had very early stage, like TRL 3 or 4 level that haven't been commercialized, then we need to consider many other uncertainty. For example, when you scale up, whether your performance will be largely dropped down or there are potential failure at certain stages. So it's all about uncertainty and how we match those uncertainty sources with the technology maturity level and how we really simulate and represent that in our models. I think that's a great question, especially for new technologies.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation. So you mentioned TRL, and I think the next thing that my brain jumped to was ARL, so adoption readiness levels. I was wondering how you consider that as well when you're thinking about
The adoption, like technology
like
adoption.
Exactly, and like if the society in general is ready for that technology, even if it's really like high in TRL.
So that's why in our COT projection, I only show you the most optimistic scenario, but we actually have many other scenarios. And the COT is the one because they already commercialized. So we actually have some market data about which in the region and how much they already penetrate in the market. And based on those data, we try to simulate different level, like say if you have a fast adoption versus you have slow adoption. And also we match them with different decarbonization goal posed by those building industry. There are many reports about that. But if you're looking at many other technology that have a very early state of TRL, then for the adoption, we would need a much more scenario based on the nature of the technology. Like we need to consider what are the potential competitors of this technology, which product it's replaced, and how large that market potential would be. And also consider at the supply side, if the technology is really resource constrained, like you are using a very specific biomass, then we need to consider how that would affect the market penetration. Don't be shy.
I had a quick question about your Mata Atlantica case study. So if you switch to cross-laminated timber, where's the pulp and paper coming from? And do you have leakage built into your models?
Yes. So in that one, we do not have the leakage because that's one we do not have a global land use model on that. So we majorly looking at the regional level, how that COT and biochar would grow, or how the pulp and paper group grow, but we do not looking at how the global market would respond. But in the COT global level study, that is where Professor Robert Mendelssohn's global timber model really do a good job because they can simulate how the pulp and paper production in different regions would respond to these global demand changes. But that leakage may happen in the Brazil. That's a good point, but we didn't quantify and simulate that specific one.
We have, one more, maybe.
That's one.
What are you looking to apply your life cycle analysis models to next?
You mean for the next one?
Yeah.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about our future project. Yeah, so for those nature-based solution study, I presented many of them are region-specific case study, right? We're also looking at the different CDRs. And I'm really interested to looking at the possible synergy of those different CDR solutions at a different region and consider global market responses. That is a very ambitious answer. We're still trying to figure out how to do that. And this is probably another 4 or 5 years project, but that's one very interesting direction we can work on. My group also work on some other direction I don't have time to cover. That is about the environmental impact of artificial intelligence. So I gave some panel discussion early this year where we're really looking at what are the potential environmental impact if AI as an emerging technology get widely adopted in our society. And that's a project that's still in early stage because we find a lot of nuance and a knowledge gap where we don't even know how to answer that. But that's a very interesting direction that my group will be very active pursuing in the following year. Thank you for the great question. Thank you.